Before I begin my sermon this morning, I'd like to start with a disclaimer. Got some smiles from that. Oh, this is real. This morning, I'm going to offer a critique on certain elements of both Christianity and Buddhism. Both faith traditions have a beautiful and rich history, and many of the people in my life that I personally consider spiritual giants are Buddhists and or Christians. So I hope you understand that my little musings today should not be construed as an attack or an insult on either. Nevertheless, I will be sharing, frankly, part of the reason that I personally do not identify with either tradition. And I offer these personal thoughts to you this morning simply for your consideration. As always, it is my hope that you will take and hold whatever resonates with you and reject the rest. And at the very least, I hope this sermon can inspire some lively conversation downstairs for coffee hour. Tomorrow is the autumnal equinox. Historically, this has been celebrated as that time when the earth receives approximately an equal amount of both light and darkness. It is therefore a day to recognize and celebrate balance in all its sundry forms. Balance, when it comes to metaphorical concepts of light and dark, was not something that I really got a chance to explore much in my evangelical Christianity. One of the first Bible verses I had to memorize as a child was 1 John 1:15. God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Even as a child, this idea was highly problematic for me. See, I was also taught that God was the creator of all things, that he existed in all things and everywhere. So how could an omnipresent creator of all not also inhabit and exhibit darkness, whether literal or metaphorical? When I asked this question to my Christian teachers and pastors growing up, I never really got an answer that satisfied me. But over time, I guess I came to the conclusion that Christianity simply didn't want to deal with the possibility that the God of light could also be the God of dark. So they excised darkness from the theistic equation. You know, that is something that we humans are awfully good at. Excising the parts of a whole that we don't like, the parts we find difficult, the parts we find personally unpleasant. Back when I was a high school English teacher right here in Jacksonville, I taught Hamlet. One day I was approached by a concerned parent who requested that I consider, maybe skipping over all the sex and violence in Hamlet. My first reaction was, yeah, because 18-year-olds don't know anything about sex. I didn't have the heart to tell him. And then my second reaction was, you realize that if I take all the sex and violence out of Hamlet, the play is like 5 minutes long, right? We see the ghosts, to be or not to be. The rest is silence. Curtain. So this sentiment, this desire to expurgate offensive material, it's nothing new. In the 1800s, Thomas Baudelaire, an English physician, edited the plays of Shakespeare to make them more appropriate for the sensitive ears of women and children. He excised all the dirty and bloody bits. He called his new and improved collection the Family Shakespeare. Censoring Shakespeare. I'm an English teacher. Oh my gosh. Appalling. How can you alter someone else's words just to make you personally more comfortable? Oh. Wait. If you have a gray hymnal, take it and open to number 471. As some of you turn there, you will see something that looks rather familiar. Allow me to read to you out of the gray hymnal. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. Oh, snap! We did it ourselves! We did it ourselves to ourselves. Oh. We UUs bowdlerized our own UU covenant. We excised the last three words, "and with God." If early Christians excised the dark half of God, we took God out of the equation entirely. Why did we do this? Well, I imagine the argument is that our congregation, of course, has several atheists and agnostics who worship with us, and they might balk at the idea of creating a covenant with God, so in a spirit of inclusivity, to make us all feel comfortable, to help us avoid any discomfort, we excised the three offending words. Were we justified in making this decision? When we choose to excise words from text, the words we eliminate speak volumes about who we are, who we want to be, and what our values are. It's an important decision. Let's take a look at one more example of excision. How many of you have had the pleasure of using the toilet in the front office? Show of hands. It's not that type of excision. No, it's still on. Just flow with me for a second. That bathroom is open and available to all. I invite you to check it out sometime if you have not yet partaken. Now, if you have used that bathroom, then you may recall that hanging on the wall as soon as you enter is a poster, right? And on that poster are the words of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. In fact, here it is right now. Jonna, would you grab our poster and bring it up? Ecclesiastes is a book from the Old Testament of the Bible. It is considered holy scripture by both Jews and Christians. It's also the text that Unitarian Universalist Pete Seeger used for his song, Turn, Turn, Turn. I love this scripture. It speaks to me personally. It is a poetic reflection on balance and harmony. And if I may, I'd like to read this adaptation that appears in our church bathroom right now. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to pull down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time for mourning and a time for dancing, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time for silence and a time for speech, a time to love, a time for peace. Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 8. Thank you, Donna. Now, those of you like me who are well acquainted with this scripture, or at least are familiar with the Pete Seeger version, you may have noticed several lines have been excised, bowdlerized, if you will, from the original text. Here's what was cut out: a time to be born and a time to die, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to hate and a time for war. This bathroom poster raises several very important philosophical questions. Is there a time to kill? Is there a time to hate? Is there a time for war? If yes to any of these questions, when? And finally, are we justified in excising these statements from an ancient text considered sacred to millions of people, a text whose entire thesis is to extol balance and argue that there is a time for all things under the sun? These are the questions I have to ponder every time I use the bathroom around here. That's part of the reason I spend so much time in there. Hashtag minister problems. Forget about the darkness within God. What about the darkness in the human soul? We are killers. We hate. We create war. There is a natural human impulse towards aggression and cruelty, the thanatos, or death instinct, identified by Sigmund Freud. It is a part of who we are as human beings. And that dark side of the human soul, it does create suffering. So, does embracing balance mean that I must also embrace human suffering and destruction as inevitabilities? You know, maybe excising darkness wasn't such a bad idea after all. Certainly Christians would say so, as would most Buddhists. It may not seem apparent at first glance, but I would argue that Christianity and Buddhism share many commonalities. I've often thought that if I were a visual artist, I would someday paint a masterpiece, or at least some picture, and it would be a picture of a cross rising out of a lake with a lotus blossom in front of it to represent how I see the relationship between these two traditions. The deep and compassionate concern that both Christians and Buddhists have for the suffering others has, in my opinion, it's what led them to adopt a common philosophy and a common ultimate value, which all stem from a common root of Neoplatonism for our philosophers out there. I would argue that the ultimate good in both Christianity and Buddhism is to end or avoid suffering, both for the self and for as many others as possible. It's a very compassionate good. It's a very good good. Now, for the Christian, the final place where there is no more suffering, no more aging or changing or dying, that's known as heaven. For the Buddhist, this state of imperturbable, unchanging non-suffering is known as nirvana. And the path to both is essentially the same. It comes through denial of self, killing desire, as the Buddhist might say, crucifying the flesh, as the Christian might articulate. And as I understand and interpret these principles, they both argue for excising the darkness from our human existence and experience by eliminating our natural human desires. But that would suggest that our natural human desires and instincts are evil. So what of inherent worth and dignity? Enter Friedrich Nietzsche. As an aside, I must admit, I am a fan of Nietzsche. I've generally found the writings of most philosophers quite dry. Not Nietzsche. Nietzsche writes from the heart, with passion. He writes some pretty audacious stuff. He describes his own work as philosophy with a hammer, which he uses to smash and destroy all the idols to false gods erected by other philosophers and religions. So basically, Nietzsche is the self-proclaimed Incredible Hulk of philosophy. You can imagine him reading some postulate by Schopenhauer, volcanoes going off in his eyes. He rips off his shirt Lou Ferrigno style. Nietzsche smash! This is Nietzsche. He often contradicts himself. Sometimes he makes no sense at all. Everything he says should be taken with a grain of salt. But he is always an entertaining read. In fact, whenever I read Nietzsche, I imagine him standing on a table at a frat party with a drink in his hand and a lampshade on his head. But in vino veritas. In college, I read something Nietzsche wrote about the Christian response to suffering and desire, and although I was a Christian myself at the time, his words left an indelible impression on me. He said this: the most famous formula for killing the passions is contained in the Sermon on the Mount. If thy eye offend thee, pluck it out. To exterminate the passions and desires merely in order to do away with their folly and unpleasant consequences, this itself seems an acute form of folly. We no longer admire dentists who pull out teeth to stop them from hurting. The Christian church combats the passions with excision in every sense of the word. Its cure is castration. It never asks, how can one spiritualize, beautify, or deify a desire? To attack the passions at their root means to attack life at its root. There is something in these words that has rung true for me for the last 15 years of my life. I can only speak for myself, but personally, I don't think I want to pursue a life that seeks to kill my natural human instincts and desires, even the dark ones. For me, I recognize that my very humanity is in those desires. In my personal search for another way of conceptualizing and harmonize both compassion and desire, I stumbled upon Taoism. One of the major tenets of the Tao is the philosophy of yin-yang, and we all saw the familiar symbol this morning. I believe it's down here. Thomas put that together for us. It's a deceptively simple symbol, but it represents a rather complicated way of understanding the universe, and Thomas explained much of this earlier. I won't rehash it all, but I do want to emphasize that the one great shortcoming of this symbol is that it does not reflect motion. This is meant to be a moving symbol. If Taoism were invented today instead of 2,500 years ago, the yin-yang would be a GIF or an animation, and it would be moving and flowing and rotating, not static. In a very reductionist nutshell, and there's a lot of reductionism going on here today, I own it. But in a rather reductionist nutshell, yin-yang theory suggests that everything in the universe has a light and dark qi, the yin and the yang. The two do not blend. They are in a constant dance with each other, which creates flow and harmony and motion. Although there is black and white, light and dark, it makes little sense to call light good and dark bad. Both simply are, and both are necessary. And the two little dots, those are the most important part, because they remind us that in all light there is some measure of darkness, and in all darkness there is some measure of light. The unavoidable results of the dance of the yin and the yang, the light and the dark, is motion. Think of it as wind. Wind is the movement of air created by vast differences in atmospheric pressure, high pressure, low pressure, often associated with temperature differences, hot and cold. The different pressures meeting each other causes the air to move. We call this wind. Wind is a dangerous, sometimes deadly force. And so I understand the temptation to seek to eliminate it, which, again, as I would argue, is the Christian and Buddhist goal. You see, one literal translation of the word nirvana is no wind. Nirvana represents a completely still, completely unperturbed state of being. The Christian heaven likewise represents a stillness, a lack of motion, a cessation of the natural cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. It represents a suspended animation in never-ending, never-aging, never-changing life. As for me, and again, I can only speak for myself, both literally and metaphorically, I love the wind. I am from Kansas, after all. You know. Kansans, like me and Jeannie, we lasso tornadoes in our backyard. Without wind, a boat cannot sail. A kite cannot fly. Some of my most exhilarating moments of transcendence have occurred in nature, where the wind literally stole my breath, and in that experience, I felt the breath of the divine. On this equinox, I will choose to remember my love of balance, my love of the wind. And despite the beauty and the peace they each promise, for me, I must reject heaven, and I must reject nirvana. I choose the wind. Is that the right decision? I don't know. Will I change my mind in the far or even near future? Oh, probably. I'm a UU. But as for today, I choose to embrace the wind. Blessed be.